Happy Sunday, beautiful community. A little react video. We scroll, and when we find something interesting, we go for it. So I think it's a little clip from Mark Galeotti first.
See, up to now, his secret has always been to pick easy fights. And this is why I was so perplexed about the prospect of war. Because I'm thinking, surely he can't be so stupid as to think that a country of more than 40 million people, a country that spent the last 8 years expecting and preparing for a Russian invasion, can't think this is going to be a pushover. But the irony is that the very people who were most bullish about the fact that the Russians would invade, and that's particularly, we're obviously particularly talking about the sort of American think tank close to the government sort of community, were also the ones who seem to be most bullish that 2 weeks and it'll all be over, which is clearly what Putin was thinking.
Okay. So I'm very sympathetic to what Mark is saying here. What's interesting is that the Russian regime in February 2022 was not prepared for the kind of war it was embarking on. So you can think of that regime as somebody coming out onto the street in office gear, and suddenly they have to run and participate in military exercise. So they are throwing off their jacket, tightening their shoelaces, but they're still wearing an office suit, and coins are flying into their pocket as they run, and a few blocks down, they've somehow managed to pull on some military pants, but they're still wearing an office shirt and office shoes, and their shoelaces have come undone, and they've lost their credit card. So any analysis of that regime at the time had to take account of what Daniel Treisman and Sergei Guriev might call informational autocracy, the idea that this is a regime that's an informational autocracy, and therefore it only does the kind of war that can be willy-nilly introduced into the informational environment and removed from the informational environment without necessarily anything on the ground changing. You can do that with the sorts of things the Russians were doing in Syria, but you cannot do that with a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And we could see as soon as the war began that the regime was not prepared for it. Now we're a couple of years down the line, and they're still not prepared for it, but they're now running down the street with maybe some kind of military cap on. They have military shoes now, but they're still wearing the office shirt, and they have a weapon in one arm, but they have an umbrella in the other. And interestingly, it is my analysis that the militarization of their gear, if you like, is something that they're co-opted into, right? That they can't sort of re-civilianize their gear as they run. They're screwed. And that, of course, affects the kind of analysis I've given you of what may or may not happen next. And so you could see also this kind of swatting response once the war began, where they tried to take things out that were not compatible with what was happening, and that constituted a couple of, totalitarian turns. They had to take out the remnant islets of relatively independent media. Now, it's debatable to what extent this was pre-planned as opposed to a spontaneous reaction to the invasion turning out to be not a coup but a full-scale war. But you could see them walking around swatting this stuff because they were not in the right kind of shape for the enterprise they got themselves into. Now, one of the consequences of this for predictions of the war is that there was at least one reason, namely that the regime wasn't set up for full-scale war. There was at least one reason for Russia experts to be skeptical of the possibility or probability of the invasion. And that did lead to a situation where sometimes people who knew more about Russia showed a bit of skepticism about whether the full-scale invasion would happen, and people who knew less showed less skepticism. That also worked the other way around when it came to considering other factors we haven't mentioned. But there was at least this one fact that somehow actually made people who knew more reticent to put their cards on the table and say that what happened was going to happen. There were people like Greg Uden who came out and predicted what was going to happen roughly for the right reasons. But I want to point out that there was this basic problem we've got to recognize of the regime not being set up for the kind of enterprise it was going to be engaging in. And anybody who knew the country closely was therefore going to be troubled by how that paradox was going to be overcome. Now, another interesting point about this conversation is that obviously we've got to privilege predictions of historical events for the right reasons against predictions that were made for reasons that aren't explanatorily dense, that aren't in friction with what's actually going on. Now, that doesn't relegate predictions of the war to zero interest. I don't think that John Mearsheimer's prediction of a full-scale war has zero interest, but it has much less interest than a prediction by somebody who predicted it for the right reasons. And perhaps one last remark here is that we swim in an enormous amount of BS when it comes to talking to ourselves in the public sphere about predictions. We have a tendency to not hold commentators accountable for predictions they make and have made in the past. We do that, I feel, because we are rather soaked in a lot of magical thinking about what it means to make an historical prediction. And that magical thinking is either about just not having a coherent picture of what historical prediction or historical retrodiction is at all, or having a rather scientistic picture of it, as though there are some law-like features of historical process we could cling on to and therefore make predictions that, at least to some extent, have the analogous exactitude and generality to the natural sciences. And so because our views about this are very flawed, we allow an enormous amount of BS to percolate in our as it were, prediction-giving discourse. And here I think it's important for journalists to hold commentators a bit better to account, not to cancel anybody, but just hold commentators a bit better to account for their record of predictions. Because we often have this situation where people simply start on a new page, even though they've said 77 things about the world, that have often turned out not to be right, and that's not impacted the way we're sort of facilitating them to start a new page. And doesn't mean we don't listen to them, but it means that that should be part of, if you like, the journalism-mediated testimonial credibility experts get. The former UK Prime Minister Liz Truss is next. May the force be with us.
Certainly right as if you think his presidency would be a good thing for America and the world if he were to be re-elected.
I do believe that, yes.
Good for Ukraine?
Yes. I certainly feel, having served as Secretary of State under a Trump administration and under a Biden administration, I think the world was safer when Trump was in charge. And I also think that is true with respect to Iran. I think the Biden administrations have shown weakness on Iran, and that has led to the situation we've seen in the Middle East. So I'm not going to spend this interview justifying every bit of rhetoric Trump says, but just my own experience of being in government, I felt that the US was a stronger force under Trump.
Now, virtually any issue globally that you can think of, from the climate crisis to Ukraine to poverty in Africa, is going to be anything but deleteriously impacted by a Trump presidency. But that's not what we want to talk about here, I think. What we want to do is just be very simple and very visceral, because this is about stuff coming our way as citizens that we've got to react to properly. And I just want to start with 2 simple steps. Categorize this thing that we're hearing, and then oppose it. And then third, maybe understand it. And that order between oppose and understand is important. So categorize, oppose, and then understand. By categorize, I really mean that you've got to put this in 1 or 2 boxes. Are we dealing with an entrepreneurial politician? And an entrepreneurial politician is somebody who just surfs the waves of public opinion, the waves of algorithmic and audience capture mediated opinions out there in our society for personal advantage. Is that what we're looking at? So a political entrepreneur? Or are we looking at a anti-democratic post-truth politician who is not just out there to surf for personal advantage entrepreneurially, but is actually out to positively break the democratic game? Entrepreneurial activity erodes democratic institutions, democratic ritual, but it's not out to break it. The erosion is a byproduct of it. But then there is that second group of politicians, Trump is in it, Boris Johnson is in it, in the West, who are out to break democratic institutions. And that's what we start with. We categorize. Of course, there's the possibility that this is a constitutional conservative speaking, conservative politician who is still committed to democratic institutions, committed to ritual, committed to checks and balances, counter-majoritarian institutions, and so on. Now, obviously, we're not looking at a conservative here who is a conservative. We're looking at an ex-conservative or a lapsed conservative, or conservative, more likely he was never a conservative. I don't think we're looking just at an entrepreneurial politician. I think we're looking at a breaker of democratic institutions. Now, that's compatible with entrepreneurialism, but being an entrepreneur doesn't make you a breaker of institutions, right? So the first is categorize: entrepreneur or post-truth anti-democratic populist. And here we say post-truth democratic populist. Then we come to oppose. And oppose just means putting our hand up, even if it is to ourselves and if it is just at our dinner table, and saying, okay, this one isn't like the others. I see that, I get it, and whatever political impact I have as a voter, I'm going to exercise it accordingly, right? So I get that what I'm seeing here is not John Major or some kind of conservative or right-wing politician who I might, if I were right-wing, agree with, or if I'm not right-wing, I might vehemently disagree with, might find them, expressing grossly offensive views to me, grossly unjust views, but they're still committed to democratic institutions. They're just a constitutional conservative. Right? What we're saying to ourselves is we see that that's not one of them, and we see that that's not one of them, not just by that relatively minor distance of being a political entrepreneur, but by this major distance of being a wrecker, a breaker, right? So that's all opposition means. And then third comes understanding. And by understanding, I don't mean understanding the particular politician. We've already categorized them. I mean understanding why they are appealing to people, why they are giving a sense of empowerment to people, why people feel, okay, well, my sense of agency is engaged by this person. Okay, so now I can believe again a little bit in politics. What is it about that disgraceful behavior that makes good and decent voters all over the country believe? right? That's that third bit of understanding. Well, let me just briefly raise something else that I think is a less significant point, but I'm often asked about it, so I'll answer it now. Is it ethical to talk about people's neurodiversity in public unless they talk about it first, or unless they recognize it and then talk about it first? No, broadly speaking. So if somebody is on YouTube and they have a very big channel discussing how endlessly marvelous elephants are, and they have 10 million subscribers, and I sit here and I obviously feel, well, that's a lovely channel, amazing presenter. I think that presenter is autistic, right? Is it ethical for me to go around saying that? No, it's not at all. It's just not appropriate. I can shut up, or I can send them a letter and saying, hey, I don't know, it looks like that could be something you may explore. But contrary to what many people in the neurodiversity community would say, I'm afraid this ain't how it works when it comes to politically significant public figures. And that doesn't just cover politicians, it covers people who have a very big impact on our politics. For instance, somebody who owns X, owns Twitter, is in that category, whereas the elephant YouTuber isn't. And that doesn't answer the question of who and how is in a position to raise questions about neurodiversity. But I think at least it means that under certain circumstances it's appropriate. I've got to be careful here. There's an enormous amount of nonsense spoken about neurodiversity. You just put in, ADHD into YouTube and you're going to see all kinds of people from Gabor Mate to Brett Weinstein talking about it. I have no idea what they're talking about. So we've got to talk about it from the point of view of the best scientific understanding. But nevertheless, if somebody's neurodiversity impacts decisions they might make, and these decisions in turn impact issues like the survival of the world, then in an appropriately responsible way you can talk about it. And then I actually think there's a second category here, and that is people from the distant past. I do think it may be ethical to raise such questions about an historical figure from 200 years ago. So I get a lot of correspondence from folks with autism and folks with ADHD, very beautiful correspondence, quite regularly actually. Sometimes I get a bit of critical correspondence asking why it is that I sometimes talk about it in public in respect of political figures. And this is my answer. In other words, that right to privacy absolutely remains, but the public right to know is a right that comes in and outweighs it when we talk about leaders of major powers who have their finger on the nuclear button potentially. Next, we've got Claire Lehmann from the publication Quillette on critical race theory.
The thing that frightens me the most about critical theory, which has become this dominant explanatory theory within a great portion of academia, is that it doesn't allow for neutrality or impartiality. Yeah. So when you say it's not enough to understand the world, the point is to change it, it forces one to take a position. They see people who are trying to remain impartial or neutral as the enemy. And so it's really frightening, because unless we have a space where one can be apolitical or neutral or impartial, we lose our ability to analyze things objectively. Imagine being a person on a jury and you haven't even looked at the evidence, but you've got to decide whether someone's guilty or not guilty. I mean, we'd be living in the dark ages again. But this is what this theory is doing, and we're training the younger generations to think in this way, which is what scares me the most.
So let's launch ourselves a little bit into a chat about culture wars. Now, what do we do when we talk about culture wars? We realize that as much as possible, we have to get beyond thinking about what divides us in terms of us versus them, and thinking about the fact that what divides us is actually a product of pools and forces that are acting in common upon all of us, to which we're reacting differently. So I think you all would have heard the culture war wash around critical theory / critical race theory. What the hell is that about? What the hell is going on there? I think you've got to put three baskets on the table and understand that they're completely separate baskets in principle. One basket is an articulation of what I call hyper-identity politics by folks like Ibram Kendi or Robin DiAngelo. And that comes with various generalizations about whiteness. It comes with various claims about the special epistemic status that being of a particular race gives one. That comes with various ideas about the moral centrality of political disagreement, about the centrality of identity to political disagreement, about the centrality of getting institutions to culture their participants into making certain positions, political positions, a matter of their identity and so on. So that's just one basket. I call it the hyper-identity politics basket. You could put folks like Kendi and DiAngelo in there. And of course, that kind of hyper-identity politics is a threat to democracy. And it's full of comically half-baked ideas that are, to use a technical term, silly. Second basket. Second basket is actually what is called critical race theory. And I don't believe any such theory exists. It's rather a set of assumptions that are basically about the idea that conventional liberal ways of thinking about structural disadvantage and race-driven structural disadvantage are inadequate, and that we need some other ideas to help ourselves. And that operates in a very limited field of legal analysis. Right? So we're talking about something very, very small in a very particular field. It's not a theory, it's just a few assumptions. One of its central assumptions is completely undistinctive to it. And indeed, it's that racism can be structural or systemic. I believe that assumption is indeed correct, but it's completely undistinctive. In some critical race theory, you get other assumptions that recommend us to reject, for instance, assumptions about giving up on truth in a sort of postmodernist way. Then there is the notion there of intersectionality, the idea that the intersection of salient social features can in a special way generate a sort of spiral of disadvantage. So your gender, your race, your class can come together in that way. And that's also a reasonable idea as far as it goes. So we've got two baskets so far. We've got the first basket of fashionable nonsense that is an expression of hyper-identity politics. We've got a second basket that is an expression of some good and some questionable assumptions in a very small subfield of legal analysis. And then we've got a third basket, and that basket is much closer to my expertise, and that is critical theory proper. And critical theory proper is indeed not just a set of assumptions, but a reflectively, if not theoretically, dense tradition. And that tradition comes with its own assumptions that we could reject, we could accept, but it's certainly an interesting tradition, it's an important tradition. And the idea that we could just reject it outright as having nothing to say to us is really silly. So what's that tradition about? Well, I think maybe critical theory experts might not be happy with this, but I think at the level of concerns, one very basic concern of critical theory is that what you think politically, what your political views are, can only be properly assessed, whether you're right or not, or whether they're good views for you to have, if we look at how the views have come about. So we are tying the question of the validity of your views to questions about what social forces and power dynamics generated them. And of course, the reason we're doing that in that tradition is because we're worried that your views may be distorted by particular power relations of which you're either a victim or indeed an advantaged participant. And in principle, you can't reject that concern. That's an absolutely thoroughly available idea, right? I mean, if you've got an 11-year-old child called Alice, and Alice wrongly thinks that the earth is flat, and then we discovered that's what mum and dad think, that's what uncle and aunt think, that's what their local social circle thinks, and anybody who didn't think that got expelled from that social circle. What are we going to say about Alice's views? We're going to say that to some extent, to some significant extent, they're a product of these social forces around Alice. Likewise, in a more serious way, we can ask, how far are the political views of the Russian population a product of the power the Putin regime exercises over them? Right? So there's a question about the validity of the views of that population that connects the question with interest in how these views have come about. And of course, it's a difficult question to answer, but the idea that it's a coherent question can't really be questioned. The idea that it's an important question can't really be questioned. So here we are, as Westerners, as Europeans, we just acknowledge this tradition in our culture, and we acknowledge that it just gives us some basic concerns. And so you see what the problem already is. That we've got this sort of rather masturbatory gun that the woke brigade uses to direct at all of this stuff. And it is typically, not in every case, but typically directed in an indiscriminatory way at all of these three baskets. And that's not really okay. I mean, you're not going to confuse Robin DiAngelo with Adorno, for goodness sake. So we have got to be a bit more responsible about what's going on in distinguishing critical theory from critical race theory, and in distinguishing critical race theory from various intensely silly and frivolous and historically fleeting fashionable assumptions. Now, let's take perhaps one more example here. Well, let's pick something close to my heart, the world of classical music. One of the things that I am less worried about, but I'm always interested in, is the business of female conductors. And we could intersectionally here add non-white female conductors too. The world of classical music is becoming more diverse, with people being allowed to express their talents in the way they weren't in the past, but there's a few areas where we can still do a lot better. And so I'm worried about that, I'm concerned about that, and I'm sure that some of these interesting assumptions we've just put on the table a few minutes ago could help us understand, what we can do to bring it about that some other kid called Alice, who's growing up, has the same opportunities if she's to become a conductor of an orchestra as, white middle-class Ricky down the street. And that's entirely reasonable. But what's not reasonable is to say something like this, and this is actually to some extent happening in some musicology departments in North America, to say that there's something white supremacist about Beethoven's music. Well, how do you go about doing that? Well, you do that by arguing that the very standard by which we judge Beethoven's music to be great is itself a standard that is shaped by things white men did, and therefore a degree of racial prejudice is already built into our understanding of what makes, in this respect, great art. And therefore, when I say that the greatest piece of piano music ever written is Beethoven's De Belli Variations, I am expressing a mode of white supremacy, right? And I'm not going to analyze that claim right now, except to say that it is absolutely humiliatingly and ruinously ludicrous. Slavoj Zizek.
Is the difference between Stalinism and fascism. Every year on Stalin's birthday, all inmates had to sign a telegram to Stalin wishing him all the best. Can you imagine something like this in Nazism? On Hitler's birthday, they collect Jews in Auschwitz. You know why not? Because Stalinism is in all its horror part of European Enlightenment. So it's as if, even if you are the worst traitor, at the same time, you participate in universal reason, and you can see, of course this is all a charade, what kind of a scum you are. In fascism, this doesn't work. It would have been easy for Hitler to organize a mega trial of leading Jewish figures where they would have to confess the Jewish plot or whatever. This is meaningless in the Nazi universe. And that's the horror of Nazi anti-Semitism. You don't have to prove anything to a Jew. You just have to prove that he is a Jew. You are guilty, literally, for existing.
Mm-hmm. I think Slavoj is basically saying something right, but it's interesting enough to comment on it. The most basic thing ethically that humans, not just in the West, but especially in the West, think in the modern world is that all human beings are of equal moral worth. Now look at all the hot spots in the world where people are not treating human beings as though they were of equal moral worth, that they were all of equal moral worth. But they still sellotape the language of equal moral worth to their actions that contradict their language. And what is absolutely striking about Nazism is that it rejected this assumption, not just practically, but doctrinally. And here, basically, Slavoj and I are agreeing with the beautiful Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit, who called Nazism an attack on morality because it rejected this business of equal moral worth, not just in deed, but in doctrine. And the difference is that the Soviet experiment rejected it in deed, but not in doctrine. And that's why I think what Slavoj is saying there is roughly right. Now, the details here don't matter. I mean, in many ways, Nazism is continuous with European traditions that aren't just counter-Enlightenment traditions that might emphasize various forms of love of country, various forms of collective self-realization, expressing the value of authenticity, a very modern value. But I think there are also some ways in which what happened is an expression of Enlightenment values to transformation of society through technology and so on. But one way or another, there is this absolutely fundamental rejection of an assumption that is completely basic to us in the modern world, of an ethical assumption that is completely basic to us, and the rejection of it in principle and not just in practice. And actually that is partly why the crime of genocide, about which we'll talk on a separate occasion, is such an egregious crime to us, because it is constitutively tied to this doctrinal rejection of equal human moral worth. And that's why when that doctrinal rejection is absent, you can have appalling slaughter, you can have ethnic cleansing going on, some of the worst things that we can imagine, but it ain't genocide unless that ingredient is there, actually. And we'll have a separate conversation about why that's so. And in the Soviet enterprise, once the experiment percolates through sufficiently, everybody's included in the end. So there is this fundamental difference that introduces a special degree of evil into the Nazi experiment. But that is not to be confused with an individual question about whether Hitler or Stalin were more evil as individuals, which one of them was more evil as an individual. That, I think, is a separate question that can't just be read off from what Zizek has said and from what I have said. Thank you so much for surviving this, and I'll engage with any thoughts you have below. Lots of love.